Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'll be going over important interrupts in Shadowlands Mythic Plus. A common issue I hear about from players beginning to push keys is not knowing exactly what needs to be kicked, which can often lead to wipes with just a single missed ability, especially on fortified weeks. To help with this, I've put together a comprehensive list of all high priority and moderate priority kickable abilities in all 8 Shadowlands dungeons. I'll be putting out similar videos for things like purges, dispels, frontal cones, and tank busters, so keep an eye out for those as well. Remember, if you found this video useful, please make sure to like and subscribe for more content like it, and let's begin with the other side. Starting in that center circle that you start off in, there are a couple of mobs that you need to be aware of. First, the Risen Cultists have an ability called Scribe, which just deals random damage to any target in the party, not necessarily your tank, and so you want to make sure you are kicking as many of these as possible. The first pack has several in it that you start off in, and then there's just one pack near the Hakar room that has a single one, and then the one near the Ardenweld room also has a couple you have to deal with. So just watch out for those Scribe kicks, as they can add up very quickly, especially on fortified weeks, and start nuking people down. They have another kick, I think it's believed Death Lotus. I would not recommend kicking this. This just spawns the little purple swirlies on the ground, but that is 100% avoidable, and you shouldn't be wasting too many kicks on that, as there's other kicks you need to get done here. On top of this, there is a Death Speaker ad in a couple of the packs, I believe outside Hakar's room and the Ardenweld room, and he has a couple of abilities that you want to kick. Death's Embrace is the higher priority one, which just gives a big haste buff to a random ally, or enemy, I suppose. And that's very, very scary for your tank to deal with, as he's already going to be taking a lot of damage in these packs. You want to be careful with that. And then if you have extra kicks that you're not putting into any scribes, you can also kick the Shadow Core from the Death Speaker, which is a big tank hit. Again, this pack is already fairly scary for your tank, so you want to just try and mitigate as much damage as you possibly can. Moving on to Hakar's Wing, there's the Devoted Sacrifice from the Atalai Devoted. This is not actually kickable, but it can be interrupted with CC, and 100% should be, so anything like stuns, disorients, those kind of things, knockbacks work as well. As if they finish their cast, they will turn into the Sons of Hakar from the boss fight and begin casting that the AoE Blood ability, which you definitely want to avoid. And they'll also drop a puddle on death. So you want to make sure they are CC'd in some way in order to interrupt that cast. Also in that hallway are the High Priests, which just have a heal that you want to kick. And the Hoodoo Hexers, which have the Hex that you want to kick, that'll hex a random party member, as well as the Healing Wave, which is just a big single target heal. They also have Lightning Discharge. This is a lower priority kick. If you have extra kicks, you can kick this. This just deals moderate damage to a random party member and anyone within 8 yards. So if you have the extra kicks, go ahead. Otherwise, it's not going to kill you, at least as below a plus 20. From there, we move on to the Mechagon Wing, and we have the Headless Clients shortly in the wing. They have Discharge, which just deals a big portion of damage to the tank, and there's nothing else really to kick in this pull, so you want to just jump as many kicks as you possibly can. Also in this wing, you have the Lubricators, which just have the Lubricate ability, which is a party-wide AoE damage and hit reduction. So you make sure you want to kick this. There's also the Self-Cleaning Cycle, which is just a channeled heal they have, another thing you want to kick. Again, not much else here to do in terms of interrupts, so you want to make sure you're getting both kicks on those Lubricators. Last up in the Mechagon Wing, we have the Sentient Oils. They will just chain cast Essential Oil, which is just random damage to a party member. Again, this can get a bit scary in higher fortified, so you want to kick as many of these as possible, just so people aren't getting insta-gibbed by this pack. That really wraps up the other side. The Ardenweld Wing doesn't have much you need to worry about in terms of kicks. There are kickable abilities, but they aren't terribly impactful or important, so you don't need to worry about it. Moving on, we have Halls of Atonement, where there are only a few kicks you need to be worried about. First, and probably most importantly, is the Loyal Beast cast. This is another unkickable ability, but can be interrupted via CC, and that's from the Depraved Houndmasters below 50% health. If this goes off, it'll enrage the nearby Gargans, and they become very, very scary and chunk your tank with just a single auto. So you want to make sure you're CCing this cast. On top of that, the Obliterators, they have the important Curse of Obliteration kick, which is just a curse that goes onto a random party member and explodes after 6 seconds. If you miss a kick, you can decurse it, just to note. They also have Wicked Bolt, which is just a moderate hit on your tank. It's not terribly important to kick. If you have extra kicks, go ahead and dump them in there. Otherwise, it's not too big a deal. And then you have the Depraved Collectors, who have a channel called Collect Sins, and this just deals some damage and spawns add every second. So you can kick this, or again, you can wait for the channel to cast, and then you can CC it to stop the channel. The only other kick inside this entire dungeon is from the Stoneborn Reavers, which a lot of groups skip. Personally, we always skip these guys. But if you are pulling the Stoneborn Reavers, just be aware of their Turn to Stone ability, which is an 8-second stun to anything within 8 yards and a 50% DR on allies. You definitely want to be kicking that if you're pulling the Reavers. From there, we have the Mists of Tirna Scithe. Again, there's a couple things early on with the Drust Harvesters. They have Harvest Essence, which is a big AoE damage to your party and a self-heal on the Harvester, so you want to make sure that channel is kicked. And then if you have extra kicks, you can interrupt their Spirit Bolt as well, which is another random damage event. So it just randomly hits a party member, and it can get very, very scary on higher fortified key levels. From there, you don't really have too much else to worry about until you get to the maze, where there are a couple adds you want to focus on. The Mistville Shapers have Bramblethorn Coat, which needs to be kicked. It just puts a shield on a random enemy, but more importantly, when you break that shield, it explodes, dealing party damage, and it roots everyone. So you want to make sure that gets kicked. And then the only other thing you need to worry about are the Mistville Tenders, which have Nourish the Forest, which is just a buff that heals nearby allies. The only other kick in this entire dungeon is in the after the second boss. You have the Spine Maw Staghorns, and they have both Stimulate Resistance, which is just an AoE Absorb Shield, and Stimulate Regeneration, which is an AoE Heal. You want to make sure both of those are getting kicked as well, but that is actually it for Mists of Tirna Scithe. Moving on, we have Necrotic Wake, which has quite a few kicks. Again, in the pretty much very first pull, you have a Corpse Harvester, which has the Drain Fluids ability, which you'll see actually throughout this dungeon. Several mobs have this. It's just a channeled stun and dot on a random target. So again, you want to make sure you're either kicking this immediately or CCing after the channel goes off to stop it. There's also the Meat Shield ability from the Stitched Vanguards, which is just a channeled absorb shield, but it gets very big very quickly. Especially that the initial tick of it is actually quite large, so you want to try and kick this cast before he gets any ticks of the channel, but worst case, you can again CC after the channel has begun. Afterward, the first boss, there's Zul'Ramis Bone Carvers, which have the Bone Flay hit on your tank. This is another unkickable ability, but believe me, your tank will thank you for CCing this to prevent it, as it's a big physical hit and max health reduction that can stack. So you want to make sure you are getting rid of that and CCing that mob with a stun, a disorient, anything like that does work to prevent it. There's also the Necromancers, which have the Animate Dead ability, and this is just an unkickable ability that will just continuously channel and spawn more skeletons. And then again, you can just CC this to stop the ability, and he will not continue casting it. In terms of his actual skeletons, there's only one you need to worry about, and that's the Brittlebone Mage, which just has the Frostbolt Volley cast, which is an AoE damage and slow, but you can keep these adds hard CC. So any form of hard CC works, that works on Undead. So Priest Shackle, Hunter Freezing Trap, Monk Paralysis, all those things you can use to just hard CC those mages, because they will instantly die as soon as you kill the Necromancer, so you don't need to worry about them. Moving on, we have the Skeletal Marauders, and they just have a Rasping Scream, which is just an AoE fear that you can kick. And there's not too much else to worry about in that pack besides the Bone Mender. The Bone Mender just spams Bone Mend, just a heal, so you make sure you kick as many of those as you possibly can, just saving one kick for the AoE fear. And then when the Bone Mender gets low health, he'll cast Final Bargain, which you'll want to stun or CC in some way, as if it goes off, it's a big heal to one of its allies and party-wide shadow damage, so make sure to stop that. Moving on into the Necropolis, there's the Corpse Collectors, which again have that Drain Fluids ability I mentioned earlier, as well as a new ability called Gore Splatter, which is just an AoE party damage and dot that you want to make sure is kicked. And then you have the Flesh Crafters, which just channel Repair Flesh to heal a nearby construct. That is it for Necrotic Wake, though. Let's move on to Plaguefall, where you have creepy crawlers on the Decaying Flesh Giant. So that's the big guy that pats around the beginning area and is on the island after the second boss. A lot of people do actually invispot this starting area, but I'm going to just go over all these kickable abilities in case you don't want to. On top of that, there's the Fungal Mancers. They have Wonder Grow, which is an AoE damage increase for their allies, so you want to make sure you're kicking that or purging it if you miss it. And then there's the Binding Fungus, which is just a root It's not terribly important, so if you don't have the kicks, don't worry about it, but if you do, you can get this one as well. Fungi Storm from the Fungi Stormers is another extremely important kick ability that isn't kickable but can be CC'd. So again, any kind of stun or disorient or knockback can stop that cast from going off, as it just deals a ton of party damage, especially on fortified weeks. The Pestilent Harvester has a tank hit in Hurl Spores. Again, low priority here. If you don't have the kicks, don't worry about it. If you do, feel free to kick these to just reduce your tank damage. Moving on past the first boss, there are the Plague Binders. They have a Gripping Infection cast, which is a dot and root on a random player, so you want to make sure that is getting kicked. And then there's the Rot Marrow Slimes, which have the Corrosive Gunk ability, which deals a dot to nearby players that stacks up. So melee especially will need to be careful on these packs, and just trying to get as many kicks as possible to reduce those stack numbers. There's also the Red Slime, the Pestilence Slimes, which cast Viral Globs, which is just a party damage hit you want to try and kick. And then you move on into the Gauntlet, where you see Slime Tentacles. The only kick they have is actually Vile Spit, which is a large hit and dot, but it's only when there's no one in melee combat, so you might see maybe one of these depending on how your explosions are working out. But if you do ever see Vile Spit, you want to make sure that gets kicked, otherwise your tank's going to get chunked. The other thing they do is Crushing Embrace on a random target in melee. It'll just pick them up and stun them and deal damage over time. So you want to try and CC this, because again, it's unkickable, but any kind of stun or those kind of CCs will prevent the tentacle from holding the player, and the player will get released from the tentacle. The other thing is after the second boss. Now, we have Defenders of Many Eyes, which channel a Bulwark of Maldraxxus. Again, unkickable. So there is a lot of unkickable spells in this dungeon, but it can be interrupted again with CC. It's an AoE 90% DR, so you definitely want to make sure this is CC'd, just because you're otherwise not going to be able to kill the back. So make sure you're getting rid of that. Then we have the Brood Ambushers. Now, there are a couple strats with these guys. If you're not too melee heavy, you can actually let the Enveloping Webbing cast, and this will just cause the Ambusher to channel an AoE root. But the thing is, while he's channeling that, he's not casting his other abilities, namely spawning Stealthlings, because these are the really scary guys. He's going to throw them in some area. They're going to start in stealth, but you'll see where they initially land, and they'll just start channeling Ambush. You need to run over to wherever they spawn and use an AoE CC, like grounding tone, not grounding tone, the capacitor totem, disorienting roar, all those things, any kind of AoE CC to stop that ambush cast, and then they'll just melee you like normal. But if you do let them get that ambush cast off, they will jump to random targets, dealing splash damage and just a ton of damage in general, and people are going to die if that goes off. That is it for the Plaguefall dungeon, though. Moving on to Sanguine Depths, not too many to worry about here. The Gluttonous Ticks at the beginning of the dungeon have an Engorge cast, which is just a channeled shadow damage ability that gives them the stacks of Engorge, and when they die, they will explode for extra damage based on how many stacks they have, so you want to make sure this is kicked. There's also the Wicked Oppressors after the first boss, which have Rack Soul, which is random damage and a stacking dot. Want to make sure that is kicked, and then Curse of Suppression, which is a 5-second single target silence, which is again a curse, so it can be dispelled if you miss that kick. There's also Dark Acolytes, which have Dark Bolt, which is again random damage. You'll see a pattern here. Random damage tends to be very scary on fortified keys, just because, I mean, anyone can get hit by it. It's not just targeted at your tank. And so if a couple people get unlucky, because these Dark Acolyte packs tend to be quite big, they can just instantly die. So you want to make sure you're kicking as many of those as you can, but obviously they are lower priority than the Rack Soul and Curse of Suppression if you have Oppressors. There's also Chamber Sentinels in this hallway, which just have a Stone Skin ability you'll want to kick, as it's a 65% physical DR. And there's also Depth Warden once you get into the circle before the second boss, which have Barbed Shackles, which is a dot and root on a random player, and it hurts quite a bit, so you want to make sure you're kicking that. Also in that same circle, you'll have Remnants of Fury and Vestiges of Doubt, where the Remnants have Explosive Anger, which is a curse that they put on a random player. It's a dot, and it's a damage increase, actually, but you will explode after 8 seconds, so there is a strategy where you actually let these go off, and you dispel it just before the 8-second explosion, but otherwise you can just try and kick these. It's not super necessary to try and have this damage increase. For the Vestiges, they just have Growing Mistrust, which is another unkickable ability. It will leave a big puddle on the ground. And just note though, unlike the other abilities I've mentioned in this list where you can CC it to stop it, the Vestige will just continue casting this ability after you CC it. It'll continue trying, so all you're doing here is delaying the cast because it drops a giant puddle on the ground that hurts a lot. So you can delay this cast, it's not super important. You can just kite out of it, but just note that you can delay it with CC. Moving on to our second last dungeon, we have Spires of Ascension, which has a couple of mobs that are very similar but slightly different throughout the dungeon. First, there's the Menders, Champions, and Warden mobs. They all have some sort of heal ability. So the Menders and Champions have Forsworn Doctrine, which is a channeled AoE heal you'll want to kick. And the Wardens have Greater Mending, which is just an instant 20% AoE heal. So make sure all those heals are kicked. Make sure packs don't last too long. There are also the caster adds, so there's Castigators, Inquisitors, and Justicars throughout the dungeon, and they all have the Dark Lash ability, which is just a random damage ability. This is the lowest priority kick. If you have extra kicks, you can kick this, but all three of these mobs also have an extremely high priority kick that will kill people if you don't interrupt it, and that is Burden of Knowledge for the Castigators, Internal Strife for the Inquisitors, and Forced Confession for the Justicars. These don't quite do the same thing, but they are essentially the same, where it's a big hit, sometimes a dot, sometimes splash damage, and for the Justicars it also spawns orbs that you have to dodge. So you want to make sure those big kicks are always gotten, those heals are always gotten, and then the Dark Lash can be extra kicks. The only other big kick you need to worry about is from the Forsworn Goliaths, which has Rebellious Fist, which is a huge party hit you want to make sure is kicked every single time, otherwise it's likely a wipe, especially on higher fortified weeks. So you'll need either 2 kicks assigned to that, or if you actually have a Shaman, they can get every single Rebellious Fist cast. So it's a good thing to have a Shaman in Spires of Ascension. Moving on to our final dungeon, we have Theater of Pain. Now, focusing on the trash here, there is the Battle Trance ability on a couple of the mini-bosses in Zav's Wing, namely Dokig and Harugia, which is just a shield and attack speed increase that can be soothed. So try and kick that. If you miss it, you can soothe it, but try and kick that if you can. There's also the Ancient Captain in that wing that has Demoralizing Shout, which just reduces all of your damage by 50%, so an important thing to kick there. Moving on to the Abomination section, there's Withering Discharge off the Blighted Sludge Spears, which is a big hit of party damage, and it puts a disease on everyone, reducing your damage and healing done by 20%. So very spooky, you want to make sure you're kicking that. There's also a Meat Shield from the Diseased Horror, very similar to the one in Necrotic Wake. Actually, it's pretty much identical. So you want to try and kick that Channeled Absorb Shield. And again, if you let the tick go off, it's a lot on the initial tick, so try not to. But you can, worst case, a CC after the channel begins. The other thing in this wing is the Putrid Butcher, which has Devour Flesh, another unkickable ability, but it is a big tank hit, but more importantly, it actually heals the mob for 300% of the damage done, so you want to try and CC him while he's casting this to prevent it. Moving on to the Necromancer wing, there's the Bind Soul ability on the Shackled Souls, which is just a channeled slow and dot on random targets. Again, this can get scary, especially because it's a random target ability and these packs are quite large, normally about 6 per pack, I believe. And so if a couple or even 3 pick one person, it's very likely they're going to die without some sort of AoE CC or an interrupt, so make sure you're using that there. Moving into the wing itself, there's the Bone Magus, which has Bone Spear, which is just a big physical hit and dot on a random target. Note that if this does target your tank, you can just let it go off, but there's not too much else in this wing you need to worry about kicking, so just kicking all those Bone Spears is never a bad thing. The last thing in this wing you need to worry about is the Maniacal Soulbinders and their Necrotic Bolt Volley, which is just AoE damage to your party and a healing absorb, so definitely want to make sure that is kicked. But that just about wraps up this video on Interrupts in Shadowlands Dungeons. If you enjoyed this video, guys, remember to like and subscribe to show your support. It really does help. As I mentioned earlier, I'll be putting out similar videos for things like Dispels and Tank Busters, so watch out for those videos coming soon. You can also check me out on Twitch at Tactics, where I stream high keys as a Guardian Druid. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.